The first time I saw the box, it was sitting in the center of the dining table like an unspoken challenge, wrapped in thick gold foil and tied with a crimson ribbon that seemed far too extravagant for a simple family dinner. It practically pulsed with expectation. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, sat across from me, her manicured hands resting neatly in her lap, her eyes fixed on my reaction before I had even touched it. The rest of the table was silent. My husband, Daniel, nervously tapping his fork against his plate. My father-in-law, Charles, pretending to butter bread but glancing up every few seconds. I felt my stomach tighten. My heart beat loud in my ears. I knew Eleanor well enough to understand that this was no ordinary gift. It was a test. Eleanor had a way of giving things that made you feel indebted. Her presence always came with an invisible string, a silent contract you were expected to honor for years afterward. I had learned this the hard way in the early days of my marriage, when she had given me an expensive bracelet, just because, and then mentioned it at every family gathering, reminding everyone of her generosity while sliding in subtle critiques about my lack of appreciation. So when I saw that gold-wrapped box, my palms went damp. Accepting it would mean opening a door I had fought to keep closed. Refusing it would mean crossing a line she would never forgive. Daniel cleared his throat, his voice tight as he said, "Go on, Emma. Open it." But I didn't move. I stared at the gift, my mind flipping through the possible outcomes like pages in a book I already knew ended badly. Eleanor's lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "It's something special," she said, her voice warm but laced with an undertone I knew too well. "Something I've been saving for the right moment." She leaned back slightly, watching me as if she could measure my gratitude in ounces, and was ready to record the results. I reached for the box, feeling the weight of everyone's gaze on me. But just before my fingers touched the ribbon, I stopped. Something in me resisted, not out of defiance, but out of a deep, bone-deep exhaustion from years of subtle manipulations and carefully crafted traps. I lifted my head, meeting Eleanor's eyes, and said softly but firmly, "I can't accept this." The room went still. Daniel froze mid-breath. Charles stopped spreading his butter, and Eleanor's smile faltered into something sharper. Her voice was deceptively calm. "Can't?" she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "Or won't?" The distinction wasn't lost on me, and I could see in her gaze that she was already framing me as the ungrateful one. But I stayed steady, even as heat rose in my cheeks. "Both," I said. My pulse pounded, but the words felt right. I knew I was stepping into dangerous territory, but something inside me, something I had buried for years, was done playing along. Eleanor's fork clinked against her plate as she set it down. "Ungrateful," she murmured, not to me, but to the room, as if making an official declaration. The word hung in the air, heavy and humiliating. For a moment, I felt every muscle in my body tense, the way you do when a fight is about to break out. But instead of lashing back immediately, I took a slow breath and decided then and there that I wouldn't just defend myself, I would end this game once and for all. What I said next would not only shatter the fragile peace at the table, but set in motion a chain of events none of us could have predicted. The tension at the table was almost physical, pressing against my skin like the humidity before a summer storm. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her spine straight, chin slightly lifted, as though she were the wronged queen in some grand court drama. Daniel's eyes darted between us, searching for a way to diffuse the situation, but he knew as well as I did that once Eleanor had planted her flag in a moment, there was no undoing it. She thrived on these subtle battles, every raised eyebrow, every calculated silence, and for years, I had played the part of the accommodating daughter-in-law, swallowing my discomfort to keep the peace. But that night, something shifted. I wasn't going to swallow anything. Not my pride, not my words, and certainly not whatever was inside that gold-wrapped box. I could feel the air change when I leaned back in my chair instead of leaning forward to placate her. "I appreciate the thought," I said evenly, "but I've learned that gifts can sometimes be more about the giver than the receiver." The words came out smooth, but my pulse thudded in my ears. Daniel stiffened beside me. I caught the way his jaw tightened, his hand gripping his napkin like it might disintegrate. Eleanor's fingers curled just slightly around her wineglass. She didn't speak, but her silence was louder than any insult she could have thrown. I knew I had just stepped off the familiar script she had written for all of us, and there was no going back. Charles cleared his throat, his deep voice breaking the thick quiet. Now, let's not make a scene," he said, though his tone carried more warning for me than for Eleanor. I turned my head toward him, giving him a polite smile that didn't quite touch my eyes. "I'm not making a scene," I replied softly. "I'm just refusing a gift." The emphasis was deliberate, and I saw Eleanor's gaze sharpen at my choice of words. She wanted this to be framed as my ingratitude, my rudeness, but I wasn't going to hand her the narrative on a silver platter. Daniel finally spoke, his voice low, as if hoping the tension might dissipate if he kept it quiet enough. "Emma, maybe just open it. It's not worth—" He stopped himself, but I knew how that sentence would have ended. "It's not worth the fight." The thing was, it was worth the fight to me. It had always been worth the fight. I just hadn't been ready to admit it before. I turned to him, met his eyes, and said, "Sometimes not opening something is the only way to keep it closed." He looked confused, but there was no time to explain. Not with Eleanor studying every twitch of my face like a hawk. Eleanor finally set down her wineglass and leaned forward, her voice as smooth as cream, but with the unmistakable edge of a blade beneath it. "You don't know what you're refusing," she said. Her words were meant to sting, to plant the seed of doubt that perhaps I was rejecting something precious, something irreplaceable. But I had been down this road before. Every precious gift came with a cost, an obligation, a debt, a reminder that I owed her, and I had decided that night that I would not owe her another thing. "Then I'll never know," I said, my voice steady despite the quiver I felt in my chest. Her eyes narrowed, but her smile returned. A thin, dangerous smile that told me she was already recalculating her next move. "Very well," she said softly, pushing the gift slightly toward the center of the table, where it sat untouched. But I noticed the faintest flicker of something in her expression, something I couldn't place at the time. Was it amusement? Anticipation? I would not understand the full weight of that look until much later, when the truth about that box, and the secrets it contained, would come crashing down on all of us. The dinner stumbled on after my refusal, but the conversation had lost its rhythm, as though every word spoken was being measured against what had just transpired. Plates were passed, glasses refilled, and laughter attempted, but each attempt felt forced, brittle. I kept my eyes on my plate, though my mind kept drifting to the unopened box sitting at the center of the table like an unspoken challenge. I could feel Eleanor's gaze on me, weighing, testing, as if she were trying to decide whether my defiance was a passing spark or the start of a fire she could no longer control. I didn't dare look at her for too long. I was afraid of what I might see there, and even more afraid of what I might reveal about myself. Daniel tried to bridge the silence by asking his father about the firm's latest project, and for a moment, the conversation shifted away from me. I let the words flow around me without listening. My attention pulled again to the gold wrapping that caught the light every time someone moved. The ribbon, a deep crimson satin, was tied in a perfect bow. It was beautiful in a calculated way, the kind of beauty that isn't accidental, but meticulously crafted to make you hesitate before destroying it. I imagined tearing it open just to see the satisfaction, or the disappointment, in Eleanor's eyes, but I kept my hands still on my lap. I wasn't going to give her that moment. It wasn't just about this gift. It was about the history behind it, the years of subtle control, the compliments that cut like blades, the help offered with strings wound so tightly they nearly strangled me. Eleanor never gave without expecting something in return. Her generosity was a currency, and once you accepted it, you were in her debt. That box was no different. Whether it contained jewelry, money, or some symbolic trinket, I knew it was bait. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that what I feared most wasn't the obligation. It was what she might have chosen that would make me want to accept it. Halfway through dessert, Charles finally addressed the elephant in the room. "So, Eleanor, what's in the mysterious package?" His tone was light, but I caught the faint thread of curiosity under it. Eleanor's eyes flicked to me before she answered, a flicker so quick I almost missed it. "Oh, just something I thought Emma might appreciate," she said with a smile that didn't match the words, "but she's decided she'd rather not know." The table chuckled politely, but there was a quiet undertone, a collective awareness that something deeper was unfolding here. I took a slow sip of my water, letting her words settle before I responded. "Some things are better left unopened," I said softly, meeting her gaze. This time, I didn't look away. The challenge was unmistakable, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw her eyes darken, not with anger, but with something far more dangerous, interest. It was as if my refusal had shifted the game into a higher gear, one she had been waiting years to play. When dinner ended, Eleanor stood and gathered her things, leaving the box in its place. "Think about it," she murmured, as she passed by my chair. Her voice was almost tender, but it carried the weight of something unspoken. I didn't realize until later, when everyone had left and the house was quiet, that I wasn't the only one avoiding the box. It seemed, somehow, that the box was avoiding me too, waiting, biding its time, holding its secret until the moment it would hurt the most. The box stayed on our dining room table overnight, gleaming faintly in the moonlight like a secret it wanted me to crave. I had told Daniel I didn't want to talk about it, and he respected that, for the most part. But the next morning, as I came downstairs in my robe, I found him sitting at the table with a coffee in one hand, his eyes fixed on the gift. "You really don't want to open it?" he asked, not looking at me, as if his question was meant for the air between us. I poured my own coffee slowly, buying time. "I don't," I said, more firmly than I felt. "It's not a gift, it's a contract." The words hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, but Daniel only sighed. He tried to defend his mother, the way he always did when I pointed out her calculated kindness. "Maybe it's just a present, Emma. Not everything is a power play." I gave him a look that made his shoulders tense. We both knew better. Eleanor never acted without intent. Even her silences had meaning. But instead of pressing the point, Daniel leaned back in his chair and said something that unsettled me more than I expected. "It's not just a gift she's giving. It's a message she's sending, whether you read it or not." I didn't answer, because deep down, I knew he was right. By noon, I found myself drifting past the table more than once, my eyes catching on the shimmer of the wrapping. I hated how it pulled at me, how it dared me to change my mind. My fingers itched to untie the bow just to end the hold it seemed to have over the house, but my pride dug in like a thorn. Refusing the gift had been a statement, and statements lose their meaning when you take them back. Still, I caught myself imagining the texture of the ribbon between my fingers, the sound of paper tearing, the possibility, however faint, that what was inside could be something I actually needed. It wasn't until the afternoon that the first crack in my resolve appeared. A courier arrived, delivering an envelope addressed to me in Eleanor's impeccable handwriting. I opened it, half expecting another pointed note about manners, but inside was a photograph. My breath caught. It was an old picture of me, taken at my college graduation, a moment I barely remembered because Eleanor hadn't been there. On the back, in her neat script, were the words, "I wanted to be. I just didn't know how." My stomach twisted, my mind torn between skepticism and something dangerously close to longing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the photograph in my mind, kept hearing the faint rustle of the ribbon in the dark, as though the box were whispering to me. Every so often, I'd imagine opening it, not to accept her terms, but to strip away her power by proving I wasn't afraid. Yet a deeper part of me knew that once I saw what was inside, I wouldn't be able to unsee it. The gift wasn't just an object. It was a doorway, and I wasn't sure I was ready to walk through it. By the time dawn broke, I realized I'd spent more energy thinking about the box than I had about anything else in days. My refusal had been meant to end the conversation, but instead, it had made me the center of a game I didn't fully understand. And the most unsettling part? I was beginning to suspect that Eleanor knew this would happen all along, that in leaving the box here, unopened, she had already gotten exactly what she wanted. Daniel suggested we go to his parents' house for Sunday dinner, as if the tension hanging between us could somehow be diluted by roast chicken and polite conversation. I agreed, though my chest felt heavy the entire drive. The box still sat untouched at home, but its presence lingered like a shadow in the car. When we pulled up, Eleanor was already on the porch, her posture perfect, a glass of white wine in her hand. She greeted Daniel warmly, kissed his cheek, then turned her gaze on me, a gaze that felt like both an appraisal and a challenge. "Emma," she said smoothly, "you look well." It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement meant to be examined under a microscope. Inside, the table was already set in that meticulous way she preferred. Polished silverware, folded linen napkins, candles lit despite the daylight. The air smelled of rosemary and butter, but under it was something colder, metallic, almost like the scent of expectation. Richard, my father-in-law, offered me a seat across from Eleanor, as though the placement itself had been arranged for maximum visibility. Conversation started light, with Daniel recounting a story from work, but I could feel Eleanor's gaze flicker over me every time I reached for my glass, every time I smiled at something Daniel said. Halfway through the meal, she brought it up. "I hope you've had time to consider my gift," she said, her tone so casual it felt like a trap. My fork froze midway to my mouth. I placed it down gently, refusing to meet her eyes just yet. "I have," I replied evenly, "and my answer is the same." There was a pause, the faint clink of Richard's knife against his plate, and then Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her lips curving in a way that wasn't quite a smile. "Daniel tells me you think it's a contract," she said, her voice tinged with amusement. "That's interesting." The words "Daniel tells me" burned hotter than the food in my stomach. My eyes darted to my husband, who looked suddenly very interested in his plate. I swallowed the sharp retort that rose in my throat, choosing instead to breathe slowly. "I think," I said carefully, "that sometimes gifts come with invisible strings, and I prefer not to spend my life tangled in them." Her expression didn't change, but her eyes gleamed with something I couldn't read. Approval, maybe, or the thrill of watching me play into her game. Silence settled over the table for a beat too long. Then she set down her wineglass with a soft but deliberate click and said, "You know, Emma, gratitude is a choice, and so is ungratefulness." The word landed like a stone between us, rippling outward in the form of sudden stillness from everyone else at the table. I could feel Richard's discomfort, Daniel's unease, the subtle tightening in my own chest. I knew I should let it pass, let the insult dissolve into the tension of the moment, but something in me refused to shrink this time. I leaned forward, my voice low but steady, and said, "And sometimes, respect is a choice too. One I hope we can both make." The air thickened instantly. Eleanor's face didn't move, but the faintest twitch in her jaw told me I had struck somewhere close to the bone. No one spoke for the rest of the meal, the clinking of cutlery now the loudest sound in the room. Yet beneath the discomfort, I felt a strange surge of power, quiet, unshaken, and entirely mine. I didn't know it then, but this was the moment that would set everything in motion. The drive home was suffocating. Daniel kept both hands on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, his jaw locked. I stared out the window at the blur of streetlights, my mind replaying the dinner over and over like a broken reel, the image of Eleanor's jaw tightening, the way her eyes sharpened after my words, burned into me. I knew I had crossed an unspoken line, not just by refusing her gift, but by challenging her authority in her own home. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Some battles felt necessary, even if they left you bruised. When we reached our apartment, Daniel shut the door behind him with a little more force than usual. "Did you have to say that?" he asked without looking at me. His voice was low, but every syllable was edged with tension. I turned to face him, arms crossed. "She called me ungrateful in front of everyone, Daniel. What was I supposed to do? Smile and nod like I agreed?" His eyes met mine then, and I saw the flicker of conflict in them, his instinct to defend his mother warring with his loyalty to me. "You could have let it go," he said finally, dropping his keys onto the counter. "You know how she gets. You don't win with her by fighting back." The words stung because they revealed something I'd suspected, but never heard aloud. Daniel had learned to survive Eleanor by yielding, not resisting. I shook my head slowly. "Maybe you don't win," I said, my voice quieter now, "but you don't lose yourself either." That last part seemed to land heavily between us, lingering in the silence that followed. Daniel didn't respond. Instead, he walked into the bedroom, leaving me alone in the dim light of the living room. I sank into the couch, feeling the weight of the evening press against my chest. My thoughts churned, about the gift, about the years of subtle comments Eleanor had made, about how often I had bitten my tongue to keep the peace. I realized this wasn't just about one dinner or one box. It was about all the ways I had been expected to accept things that didn't feel right, to play the part of the grateful daughter-in-law no matter what. I didn't notice my hands trembling until I tried to pour a glass of water. The idea that a single woman could hold such power over the atmosphere of my marriage was unsettling. I thought about the unopened box upstairs, about the possibility that it represented more than I understood, maybe even more than Daniel understood. It was a physical manifestation of Eleanor's reach into our lives, and I felt a growing unease about what refusing it might set into motion. That night, long after Daniel had fallen asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence sharper. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this drop. I needed to understand why Eleanor had chosen that gift, why she had presented it the way she did, and what she stood to gain, or lose, by my acceptance. I didn't know it then, but the answers would shake far more than just our fragile peace. They would unravel the truth about Eleanor's past, and about Daniel's. The next morning, Daniel left early for work without saying much beyond a tired, "See you tonight." His distance clung to the air like a damp fog, but I pushed it aside. My mind was fixed on the box. It sat on the top shelf of our bedroom closet, untouched since the night of the dinner. I hadn't even peeked inside. Eleanor had offered it with such ceremony, such deliberate gravity, that part of me feared what I might find. But that fear was now mixed with an itch I couldn't ignore. If there were answers inside, I needed them. I pulled the box down and set it on the bed. It was heavier than I expected, wrapped in thick ivory paper and tied with a deep green ribbon. I hesitated before untying it, almost as if I was crossing a point of no return. As the ribbon fell away and the paper tore under my fingers, I felt my pulse quicken. Inside was a smaller wooden case, polished to a shine, and locked with a tiny brass clasp. It was the kind of box you'd imagine holding something precious or dangerous. The clasp wasn't difficult to pry open. When I lifted the lid, a faint smell of cedar and something faintly metallic wafted out. Inside were neatly arranged envelopes bound with twine, and beneath them, a velvet pouch. My hands went first to the pouch, and when I loosened its drawstring, something cold and heavy slid into my palm, a gold bracelet. But it wasn't just any bracelet. It was engraved with a name. My name, not Clara, my married name, but my maiden name, the one Eleanor had never once used. The shock made my throat tighten. Why would she have something like this? I set the bracelet aside and untied the stack of envelopes. They weren't addressed to me. They were addressed to Daniel. The postmarks were decades old, the handwriting unfamiliar. My stomach flipped as I read the first line of the top letter. "You don't know me, but I am your mother." I sat frozen, staring at the words, the weight of what they implied crashing down like a tidal wave. Eleanor wasn't his biological mother. Letter after letter told the same story in fragmented, pleading tones. A young woman writing to the son she was forced to give up, trying to explain, trying to connect. The last few were returned unopened. My pulse pounded in my ears as I realized Eleanor must have kept them hidden all these years, kept Daniel from ever knowing. The bracelet suddenly made sense. It was likely meant for him, but Eleanor had kept it sealed away, perhaps waiting for a moment she could control. I sat back against the headboard, the box open before me, my hands trembling. My mind reeled with questions. Had Daniel truly never known? If he did, why had he never told me? And if he didn't, what would telling him do to everything he believed about his life, his family, his mother? I could hear Eleanor's voice in my head, sharp and calculating. "You'll understand someday why I do the things I do." Now I feared. I finally might. I closed the box but kept the bracelet in my hand, its weight strangely comforting and terrifying all at once. The decision before me was monumental: hide what I'd found, or break open a truth that had been buried for decades. Either choice could change the course of my marriage, and both would make me an enemy in Eleanor's eyes. As I placed the box back in the closet, I knew this secret wasn't going to stay hidden much longer. It was only a matter of who would speak it first. That night, dinner at home felt like eating with a stranger. Daniel sat across from me, distracted, his fork pushing peas around his plate. The knowledge of the box upstairs burned inside me, a living thing clawing at my ribs. I tried to study his face. Was there any hint that he knew the truth? His jaw was tense, his eyes distant, but that wasn't unusual lately. Part of me wanted to blurt it out right there, slam the bracelet down on the table and watch his reaction. But the fear of detonating something I couldn't control held me back. After clearing the dishes, I followed him into the living room. "Daniel," I began carefully, "can I ask you something? About your mom?" He turned his head sharply, like a deer catching scent of a hunter. "What about her?" His voice was guarded, low. I swallowed, my heart thudding. "Do you know if there's anything she hasn't told you about your family? Your past?" His eyes narrowed, suspicion mingling with irritation. "Where is this coming from, Clara?" I froze, every muscle stiff. One wrong word could ruin everything. I retreated. "I just wonder sometimes. She's so private." The lie tasted bitter. He gave me a long, hard look, then shrugged and reached for the remote, ending the conversation. My stomach churned. If he didn't know, telling him would not just expose Eleanor, it would shatter the foundation of his identity. But if he did know, why was he letting her hold the reins of the story? Either way, we were tangled in a silence that was quickly becoming poisonous. Later, when Daniel was in the shower, I sat on the edge of our bed and opened the nightstand drawer. The bracelet was there, wrapped in a scarf, its engraving catching the faint light. I turned it over in my palm, imagining the woman who had it made. Was she still alive? Did she think of Daniel every day? And if she did she hate Eleanor for what she had done? My chest ached with the injustice of it all. How lives could be rewritten simply by deciding not to hand over a letter. When Daniel came out, steam curling from the bathroom, he looked at me strangely. "Are you okay?" he asked, towel slung around his shoulders. I forced a smile, tucking the bracelet back into the drawer. "Just tired," I said, though the truth was I felt more awake, more dangerously alert than I had in years. His gaze lingered, as if sensing the weight of something unsaid, but he didn't press. That was the problem with our marriage lately. Too much space for secrets to breathe. As we lay in the dark, I stared at the ceiling, the decision pressing down like a physical weight. Eleanor had manipulated the truth for decades. If I spoke, it would undo her control in an instant, but it would also undo Daniel's image of the only mother he'd ever known. Somewhere between my pounding heartbeat and the sound of Daniel's slow breathing, I realized the question wasn't if the truth would come out, it was who would survive it when it did. The following Friday, Eleanor invited us over for dinner. It wasn't unusual, but the timing made my nerves crawl. I hadn't spoken to her since finding the bracelet, yet she greeted me at the door with a smile that was all teeth and calculation. The smell of rosemary chicken drifted from the kitchen, the table already set with her heirloom china. She thrived on control, every glass polished, every napkin folded into perfection. I couldn't help but feel like I was being arranged too, positioned exactly where she wanted me for the evening. Daniel sat beside her, looking lighter than he had all week, as though stepping into his mother's house dissolved whatever tension lived in him at home. I watched them laugh over a memory from his childhood, the way his eyes softened when he looked at her. The sight should have warmed me, but instead it made my stomach twist. I knew something he didn't. I was sitting across from the keeper of a truth that could burn down this entire scene in seconds, and part of me wanted to light the match. The meal passed in polite conversation, until Eleanor, with the ease of someone slipping a knife between ribs, turned to me and said, "Clara, I was thinking, maybe next time, try to accept a gift without making a spectacle." My fork froze halfway to my mouth. Daniel glanced at me, half curious, half wary. She was referring to that night, the night I refused her necklace in front of everyone, but she said it with a deliberate sweetness that made it sting more. The table went silent, the only sound the soft clink of silverware against porcelain. I felt the air tighten, the heat of her challenge searing my skin. I could have let it go, smiled, nodded, and kept the peace, but I'd been swallowing my words for too long. I set my fork down, my pulse thundering in my ears. "Eleanor," I began, my voice steady but low, "there are some gifts that can't be accepted, especially when they come from someone who's been hiding much bigger things." Her smile faltered. The faintest crack in her mask and the flicker of panic in her eyes told me I'd hit the target. Daniel's head whipped toward me. "What are you talking about?" he asked, confusion and alarm mixing in his tone. I didn't answer him yet. My gaze stayed locked on Eleanor. The table between us felt like a loaded weapon. She leaned forward, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Careful, Clara." It wasn't a warning for me. It was a plea to keep the walls from collapsing. The room was suddenly too small, the light too bright, every eye on me waiting to see if I'd pull the trigger. I took a slow breath, my hand trembling under the table. The bracelet was in my purse, only inches away. I could lay it out right now and change everything. But then I looked at Daniel, his confusion, his love for both of us, and I realized this wasn't the place. Not yet. So I smiled instead, the kind of smile Eleanor would recognize as a promise. "Don't worry," I said softly. "I'm not done talking. Just not tonight." Her eyes darkened, and for the first time since I'd met her, I saw something close to fear. After that dinner, the tension between us didn't fade. It festered quietly, a storm brewing beneath calm waters. At home, Daniel tried to act normal, but I could feel him tiptoeing around me, measuring every word, every gesture. He didn't know the full truth, yet he sensed its weight, and that unspoken knowledge made our apartment feel smaller, tighter. I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying every moment at Eleanor's table, every glance, every calculated word. Something had shifted irreversibly, and I could no longer pretend that life could continue as before. I kept the bracelet hidden in my bedside drawer, its presence a constant reminder of the secret I now carried. its cold weight pressed into my palm whenever I touched it, a physical manifestation of the truth Eleanor had tried to bury. I wondered how many more lies she had woven over the years, how much of Daniel's life had been shaped by deception. Every memory of his childhood now seemed tainted by the possibility of a hidden agenda, a story manipulated by Eleanor's careful hands. Daniel tried to engage me in conversation over breakfast the next morning, but his words felt distant, filtered through a veil of unease. I sipped my coffee silently, watching him, trying to measure when, or if, I should reveal what I'd found. The thought terrified me. If I told him too soon, I might shatter the trust between us. If I waited too long, Eleanor could anticipate my move and strike first. Every option carried risk, and I realized for the first time just how deeply intertwined our lives were with her manipulations. By midday, the unease had grown unbearable. I decided to leave for a walk, hoping the crisp air would clear my mind. The streets were quiet, almost eerily so, the autumn leaves crunching beneath my feet like tiny warnings. I tried to envision the conversation with Daniel, how I would approach it, what I would say, but no words felt adequate. The bracelet, the letters, Eleanor's intentions, they were all bigger than any script I could prepare. The truth had grown beyond my control, waiting for a moment to erupt. When I returned home, I found Daniel sitting on the couch, his eyes fixed on the floor. I sensed immediately that something had changed. "Emma," he began hesitantly. My heart skipped. Was he about to tell me something? Had Eleanor acted behind my back? I forced myself to remain calm, to steady the storm inside me. "What is it?" I asked, my voice soft but firm. His lips parted, then closed again, a hesitation that mirrored the tension I had been holding for days. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I found something." My stomach dropped. Could he have stumbled onto the bracelet or the letters? The thought of Eleanor's secret being exposed prematurely sent a jolt of panic through me. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral, though my pulse raced. He looked up at me then, eyes wide, and for the first time, I saw the raw fear and confusion that mirrored my own. We were standing at the edge of a revelation neither of us could fully prepare for, and the storm had begun to break. Daniel's words hung in the air like a suspended weight, each second stretching impossibly long. "I found some old letters," he said, his voice trembling. I think they're from someone claiming to be my mother." My chest tightened, and I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter to steady myself. The box upstairs, the bracelet, Eleanor's careful manipulations, they all collided in my mind. The secret I had been guarding, the one I feared revealing, was now slipping into the open in a way I had never anticipated. He handed me a single envelope, the paper aged and soft under my fingers. The handwriting was unfamiliar, curving elegantly across the front. My pulse quickened as I read the first line. "To my son, Daniel. I never stopped thinking of you." My heart stopped. The truth Eleanor had hidden for decades, the betrayal, the secrecy, the stolen connection, was now staring us both in the face. I felt a surge of anger, not just at her, but at the years of lies and the years she had stolen from Daniel. Daniel's eyes searched mine, fear and confusion mirrored there. I don't understand. I thought she was my mother." His voice cracked, and I realized how fragile this moment was. Everything he believed about his life, about his family, was unraveling. I reached for his hand, gripping it tightly, trying to anchor him while my own mind raced. How had Eleanor kept this hidden? How many decisions had she made to control him, to control me, to control all of us? We spent hours going through the letters, each one revealing fragments of a story neither of us had expected. A young woman, desperate to connect with the son she had been forced to give up, writing again and again, only to have her attempts returned unopened. And in each letter, Eleanor's shadow loomed, intercepting, rewriting, manipulating, keeping the truth just out of reach. It was a pattern of control that spanned decades, and now the walls she had built were crumbling before our eyes. Daniel finally lifted his gaze, the storm in his eyes meeting mine. "She's lied about everything," he whispered. "About who I am, about who she is, about us." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "I know," I said softly, "and it's bigger than we imagined, but we'll face it, together." For the first time, we were aligned in purpose, a united front against the woman who had dictated the narrative of our lives. I felt the weight of years of silence and fear begin to lift. replaced by a fierce resolve. As the night wore on, we made a plan. The truth had to be addressed, but carefully, strategically. Eleanor's web of deception could not remain intact, but neither could we allow her manipulations to destroy Daniel's sense of self. The letters, the bracelet, the untold history, all of it would be laid bare, but we would do it on our terms, with clarity and courage. For the first time in decades, the balance of power had shifted, and I knew, deep in my bones, that nothing would ever be the same again. The following evening, I asked Daniel to meet me at Eleanor's house. The air was thick with anticipation, every step toward the door echoing my nerves. Eleanor greeted us with her usual composure, a smile that was equal parts warmth and calculation. I felt the tension coil in my chest like a spring. I carried the bracelet in my pocket, and the letters in my bag, symbols of the truth that had been suppressed for decades. Tonight, there would be no hiding, no delicate half-truths. "Mom," I began, my voice steady though my pulse raced. "We need to talk about something important." Eleanor's eyes flicked to Daniel, then to me, her mask of calm faltering ever so slightly. "About what?" she asked, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. I placed the letters on the table, sliding the bracelet out so it caught the dim light of the chandelier. "About the letters. About the truth you've been hiding from Daniel all these years." Eleanor's composure shattered in a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of panic, anger, and something darker, fear. Daniel picked up the letters, reading quickly, his hands trembling. "All this time, all these years, why didn't you tell me?" His voice broke, the weight of her deception finally crashing down on him. Eleanor's lips pressed tightly together, her eyes flicking between us like a trapped animal. "I did it to protect you," she said, her tone defensive but fragile. "I couldn't bear to lose you again. I thought I was doing the right thing." Her justification fell flat, hollow against decades of secrets and stolen moments. I felt a mix of anger and pity, understanding now how deeply Eleanor's obsession with control had shaped our lives. "Protecting him?" I said sharply, holding her gaze. "You call keeping him from his real mother protection? You call hiding the truth, manipulating his entire childhood, protection?" Daniel's hands shook as he held the bracelet, now fully comprehending the connection Eleanor had denied him. Every memory of her influence, every instruction, every intervention. Suddenly, the past became a twisted web of calculated control. Eleanor's defenses crumbled further, tears threatening to spill. I only wanted to keep my family together. I was afraid that the truth would destroy everything. Daniel's voice was low, quiet, but cutting. "You already destroyed everything. All these years I've been living a life based on lies, and you decided when, how, and what I could know. That's not protection. That's imprisonment." The room fell silent, heavy with the weight of her admission and the magnitude of the betrayal. I placed my hand on Daniel's shoulder, grounding him while my gaze stayed on Eleanor. "It's over now," I said firmly. "The truth is here, and there's no more hiding. You can't manipulate us anymore. We decide how to move forward. From this point onward, honesty will be the foundation. You've had decades to control, but that stops today." Eleanor slumped into her chair, defeated, the veneer of power completely gone. It was the first time in years that I felt we had the upper hand, not in anger, but in clarity, in truth. Daniel stood, holding the bracelet tightly, his eyes filled with pain, disbelief, and the first spark of understanding. "I need time," he said, "but I know now. I know the truth." Eleanor remained silent, the weight of decades pressing down on her shoulders. In that moment, the air shifted. The power dynamics had reversed. The long-hidden story had been unearthed, and the path ahead, uncertain and raw, was now ours to navigate. For the first time, I felt hope threaded through the chaos, a fragile but undeniable beginning. The days after the confrontation felt surreal, as though we were living in the aftermath of an earthquake. The house, once filled with tension and carefully crafted performances, seemed hollow, the air lighter yet charged with unease. Daniel and I walked through our apartment quietly, both of us aware that nothing would ever be the same. The letters and bracelets sat on the kitchen counter, tangible reminders of the truths finally revealed. Every glance, every small gesture now carried the weight of understanding, the recognition that Eleanor's control had ended. Daniel was distant at first, retreating into long walks and hours spent alone in thought. I didn't push him, knowing that his processing would take time. Instead, I focused on my own reflections, revisiting every memory, every subtle manipulation that had once seemed benign, but now gleamed with the sheen of deception. Each recollection was painful, yet illuminating. I realized how much of my life had been affected by Eleanor's interventions, how my own choices had been shaped by the fear of her judgment. We began having long conversations late into the night, tentatively rebuilding the trust that had been fractured. Daniel asked questions, not accusatory but searching, wanting to understand how the truth had been hidden from him for so long. I shared everything I knew, every interaction, every lie Eleanor had woven, careful to remain factual but compassionate. Slowly, piece by piece, we reconstructed a version of his past that was real and unfiltered, and in doing so, we created a new space for connection between us. Eleanor, meanwhile, retreated into silence. Her power diminished. She seemed almost lost, unsure how to navigate a world in which she could no longer manipulate. I felt a mix of emotions toward her: anger, disappointment, but also a strange empathy. She had acted from fear, not malice, and while that didn't excuse her actions, it provided context. I realized that forgiveness would be a long road, one that wouldn't erase the past, but might allow for some measure of peace. One evening, Daniel and I sat together on the balcony, the city lights flickering below us like scattered memories. He held the bracelet, turning it over in his hands, lost in thought. "I don't know if I can ever forgive her," he admitted quietly. I nodded. "You don't have to, not yet, but you can reclaim your story. That's the first step." For the first time in years, I felt a sense of agency, not just for myself, but for Daniel as well. The past had been stolen from us, but the future was ours to define. We began small acts of reclamation, removing Eleanor's influence from our routines, speaking openly about her interventions, and slowly, learning to trust each other without the shadow of her manipulation. Every shared story, every remembered detail, became a thread weaving us closer together. I realized that while the past was immutable, it didn't have to dictate our present or future. Our relationship, once fragile and obscured by deception, was beginning to breathe. By the end of the week, Daniel seemed lighter, a subtle shift in posture and tone signaling his gradual reclamation of self. I watched him laugh genuinely, no longer measured or cautious, and felt a surge of relief and hope. The truth had been painful, devastating even, but it had also created the space for honesty, understanding, and a bond grounded in reality rather than illusion. And as I sat beside him, the bracelet and letters between us, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, stronger, wiser, and free. The days after the confrontation felt surreal, as though we were living in the aftermath of an earthquake. The house, once filled with tension and carefully crafted performances, seemed hollow, the air lighter yet charged with unease. Daniel and I walked through our apartment quietly, both of us aware that nothing would ever be the same. The letters and bracelet sat on the kitchen counter, tangible reminders of the truths finally revealed. Every glance, every small gesture now carried the weight of understanding, the recognition that Eleanor's control had ended. Daniel was distant at first, retreating into long walks and hours spent alone in thought. I didn't push him, knowing that his processing would take time. Instead, I focused on my own reflections, revisiting every memory, every subtle manipulation that had once seemed benign, but now gleamed with the sheen of deception. Each recollection was painful, yet illuminating. I realized how much of my life had been affected by Eleanor's interventions, how my own choices had been shaped by the fear of her judgment. We began having long conversations late into the night, tentatively rebuilding the trust that had been fractured. Daniel asked questions, not accusatory, but searching, wanting to understand how the truth had been hidden from him for so long. I shared everything I knew, every interaction, every lie Eleanor had woven, careful to remain factual but compassionate. Slowly, piece by piece, we reconstructed a version of his past that was real and unfiltered, and in doing so, we created a new space for connection between us. Eleanor, meanwhile, retreated into silence. Her power diminished. She seemed almost lost, unsure how to navigate a world in which she could no longer manipulate. I felt a mix of emotions toward her: anger, disappointment, but also a strange empathy. She had acted from fear, not malice, and while that didn't excuse her actions, it provided context. I realized that forgiveness would be a long road, one that wouldn't erase the past but might allow for some measure of peace. One evening, Daniel and I sat together on the balcony, the city lights flickering below us like scattered memories. He held the bracelet, turning it over in his hands, lost in thought. "I don't know if I can ever forgive her," he admitted quietly. I nodded. "You don't have to, not yet. But you can reclaim your story. That's the first step." For the first time in years, I felt a sense of agency. Not just for myself, but for Daniel as well. The past had been stolen from us, but the future was ours to define. We began small acts of reclamation, removing Eleanor's influence from our routines, speaking openly about her interventions, and slowly, learning to trust each other without the shadow of her manipulation. Every shared story, every remembered detail, became a thread weaving us closer together. I realized that while the past was immutable, it didn't have to dictate our present or future. Our relationship, once fragile and obscured by deception, was beginning to breathe. By the end of the week, Daniel seemed lighter, a subtle shift in posture and tone signaling his gradual reclamation of self. I watched him laugh genuinely, no longer measured or cautious, and felt a surge of relief and hope. The truth had been painful, devastating even, but it had also created the space for honesty, understanding, and a bond grounded in reality rather than illusion. And as I sat beside him, the bracelet and letters between us, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, stronger, wiser, and free. Weeks passed, and the tension that had defined our lives began to ease, replaced by a tentative normalcy. Daniel and I had created boundaries and routines that excluded Eleanor's influence, carving out a space where honesty and trust could flourish. Yet beneath the calm, a quiet uncertainty lingered. How would Eleanor respond to the loss of control? I wasn't sure if she would retreat further into isolation or attempt to manipulate her way back into our lives. I braced myself for either possibility, knowing that our newfound clarity might be tested. One evening, there was a knock at the door. My heart leaped, expectation, caution, and curiosity intertwining. Standing there was Eleanor, her usual composed exterior replaced by something I couldn't immediately identify. Humility, or perhaps vulnerability. In her hands, she carried a small gift, simple, yet thoughtful. Daniel's eyes widened, uncertain, as I invited her in. The room felt charged, every movement deliberate, the air thick with unspoken words and the weight of shared history. Eleanor set the gift on the table, her hands trembling slightly. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said, voice quieter than I had ever heard. "But I want to try. I want to be honest from now on." Daniel's gaze softened, not fully trusting, yet willing to listen. I felt a shift in the energy between us, a fragile bridge beginning to form. This was the first time she'd approached us not as a manipulator, but as someone willing to accept the consequences of her actions. We spoke for hours, words tentative but genuine, peeling away layers of hurt, misunderstanding, and fear. Eleanor recounted moments from her past that had shaped her obsessive control, revealing insecurities and regrets that had never been visible before. I listened, aware of my own feelings, anger, resentment, but also empathy. I realized that reconciliation didn't mean erasing the past. It meant acknowledging it, understanding it, and choosing to coexist without deception. Daniel, hesitant at first, finally spoke, his voice steady but cautious. "Mom, it's going to take time," he said. "I can't forget everything, but I can try to see the person behind the mistakes." Eleanor nodded, a tear escaping her carefully maintained composure. I felt a deep sense of relief wash over me. The family we had known, fractured, manipulated, and full of hidden truths, was slowly evolving into something new, a unit built on transparency, accountability, and the possibility of trust. By the end of the evening, there was a quiet sense of accomplishment. We hadn't erased the past, or fully healed every wound, but we had taken the first true steps toward understanding one another. The bracelet and letters had served as catalysts, revealing the hidden fractures that needed attention. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, I sensed a new openness, a willingness to rebuild relationships without the shadows of deception looming over us. As Eleanor left that night, Daniel and I exchanged a look that said everything without words. We had survived the storm together, emerging with clarity and connection that had once seemed impossible. And while forgiveness and trust would take time to cultivate fully, the walls of manipulation had finally fallen. For the first time in years, the future felt unburdened by the past, and in that fragile freedom, we discovered a rare and profound hope. The morning after Eleanor's visit, a sense of calm settled over our apartment, almost surreal after weeks of tension and revelations. Daniel and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the letters and bracelet neatly stored in a box, symbols of the past we had finally confronted. There was no rush to speak, no need to fill the silence with explanations or apologies. Instead, we simply existed in the quiet company of someone who understood the weight we had carried and was now ready to move forward with us. I watched Daniel pour his coffee, a small, ordinary gesture that suddenly felt profound. He was reclaiming his life, piece by piece, without the fear of manipulation or hidden truths. For so long, Eleanor's control had dictated his every move, every belief about who he was. Now, freed from her shadow, he could begin to define himself on his own terms. And I, too, felt liberated, no longer the silent witness to deception, no longer carrying the burden of her secrets alone. Later that day, we decided to reach out to Eleanor. The conversation was cautious, measured, but surprisingly warm. She spoke openly about her regrets, acknowledging the harm she had caused while expressing a genuine desire to make amends. Daniel listened, his responses honest but firm, setting clear boundaries that had long been absent. I realized then that reconciliation wasn't about forgetting. It was about honesty, accountability, and the courage to rebuild connections from the ruins of the past. As the weeks passed, small gestures of trust and understanding began to reshape our relationships. Eleanor no longer wielded control. Instead, she participated in our lives as a family member, willing to accept her mistakes. Daniel laughed more freely, no longer measuring his words, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The tension that had defined our family for decades was replaced by cautious optimism, and with each passing day, the fragile bonds grew stronger. One evening, Daniel and I walked through the park, hand in hand, the city lights reflecting on the still waters of the fountain. We spoke about our future, our dreams, and the life we wanted to create, free from manipulation and hidden agendas. The bracelet and letters were no longer symbols of betrayal alone. They had become markers of truth, of courage, of the resilience we had discovered within ourselves. Each step felt lighter, each breath more intentional, as if we were reclaiming the years that had been stolen from us. That night, as I tucked Daniel into bed, he whispered, "Thank you for standing by me, for helping me see the truth without letting it destroy me." My heart swelled with a mixture of relief and love. I realized that our bond, once fragile, strained, and fraught with misunderstanding, had been strengthened through adversity. We had faced the darkness of secrets and lies together, and in doing so, had forged a connection that was honest, resilient, and unbreakable. As I closed the door and leaned against it, I allowed myself a moment of quiet reflection. The storm had passed, leaving scars that would never fully fade, but also a sense of renewal that was more profound than I could have imagined. We had reclaimed our story, our truth, and our agency, and in that reclamation, we discovered the rarest gift of all, the ability to love one another honestly, without fear, without manipulation, and with the promise that together, we could face anything the future held.